Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking the hidden architecture behind literally every decision you make, every ad you click, and every debate you engage in. We're looking at the anatomy of persuasion.
So think about a recent, everyday scenario for a second. Maybe you were on a car lot, or, maybe just watching a political ad on TV. Have you ever felt this strange, almost invisible pull to agree, even when your absolute first instinct was to just walk away? Well, you're definitely not alone. See, persuasion isn't some kind of dark magic. It's a highly structured, intensely studied science. And today, we're going to map out exactly how it works on your brain.
Here's our roadmap for This Explainer. We'll hit 1. The persuasion equation. 2. 7 levers of influence. 3. From attitude to action. 4. The power of dissonance. And finally, 5. The persuasion radar.
All right, starting us off, Section 1, the persuasion equation.
To really understand modern influence, we've actually got to look all the way back to World War II. During the war, a psychologist named Carl Hovland and his colleagues at Yale University were basically tasked with figuring out the effectiveness of propaganda. And what came out of that was the Yale attitude change approach, literally one of the very first models of attitude change. They boiled persuasion down to a super simple formula. Who says what to whom? Right? So they discovered that attitude change is dictated by very specific variables. For the who, a speaker's high credibility, or honestly their attractiveness, massively boosts persuasion. For the what, the primacy of the message, hearing it first, that can lock in a much stronger influence. And for the to whom, well, they found that an audience's intelligence, age, and even just how distracted they are can completely alter how susceptible they are to a message. Now let's see how this builds into what's known as the elaboration likelihood model. Basically, this model tells us there are 2 totally distinct routes to persuasion. First, you've got the central route. This is used when you actually have the motivation and the energy to stop and think about a message. It requires high effort and it relies heavily on logic and cognitive responses. But let's be real, when we're tired, distracted, or just lack the motivation, we default to the peripheral route. And here, we don't evaluate the argument at all. 0 effort. We just look at peripheral cues, like, hey, how attractive is the speaker? Or do they have some fancy expert title? Which brings us to Section 2, 7 levers of influence. So, when we are operating on that low-effort peripheral route, what specific triggers are actually pulling our strings? Well, to answer that, we look to Dr. Robert Cialdini. He famously went undercover in compliance fields, like car sales, just to see these triggers in action. Because we live in this crazy, complex world with massive information overload, we absolutely rely on generalizations to make quick decisions. And persuaders, they turn those generalizations into weapons. There are 7 key principles here. Reciprocity, where we feel obliged to return a favor. Commitment and consistency. Social proof, which is just following the crowd. Liking, because naturally we trust people similar to us. Authority. Scarcity. Hello. FOMO, the fear of missing out. And finally, unity, or a shared identity. And this right here brilliantly illustrates exactly how these shortcuts take over. Sometimes, we experience this subjective feeling of ease or familiarity with a message. But instead of pausing and realizing, oh, I just feel comfortable, we misattribute that feeling as hard, factual evidence. We unconsciously let our own subjective internal experiences trigger a mental shortcut. We end up validating a persuader's message without even a second of actual critical thought. Crazy, right? Moving right along to Section 3, from attitude to action. So just having a positive attitude towards something doesn't necessarily mean you're actually going to do it, right? To understand this gap between thought and action, Martin Fishbein and Isaac Eisen developed the theory of reasoned action. They really wanted to know what actually predicts voluntary, conscious behavior. And what they found is that your own personal attitude, that's really only half the battle. The other half relies heavily on what they call subjective norms. Basically, this means social pressures, the views of everyone else around you, and your own motivation to comply with those people. All of that heavily weighs on your actual behavioral intentions. Let's look at how these steps actually build on each other in a real-world scenario. Let's say you want to start working out. Step 1, you evaluate your beliefs. Exercise is healthy, good for you. Step 2, you assess the subjective norms. All your friends are going to the gym and hey, you want to fit in. Step 3. These combine to form a behavioral intention, so you pack your gym bag. And finally, Step 4. You execute the behavior and actually go to the gym.
But wait, there is a totally critical extension to this called the theory of planned behavior. It adds one really vital component to the mix: perceived behavioral control.
Essentially, this is your perception of how easy or how difficult the action actually is. Think about applying sunscreen to prevent skin cancer. You might have a super positive attitude toward your health, and your friends might totally support it. But if the sunscreen is incredibly expensive, super messy, and just a huge hassle to apply, your perceived behavioral control completely drops, and that entire persuasion chain just breaks.
Okay, Section 4. The power of dissonance. So the crucial point here was formulated by psychologist Leon Festinger way back in 1957. And it's this: humans crave consistency. We desperately want our beliefs, our words, and our actions to match. When they don't, we experience this psychological tension, a dissonance that makes us feel awkward, nervous, or just kind of upset. To eliminate that uncomfortable tension, we are highly motivated to adjust our behavior or our attitudes, even if it means doing something we initially had absolutely no intention of doing.
And this is exactly why public commitment is so incredibly powerful. Escaping the trap of inconsistency gets way harder the more public we go. Think about getting engaged. Saying yes is one commitment, sure, but then you announce it to your friends. You pay a hefty deposit for a reception venue. You send out all those invitations. With literally every escalating public step, the potential dissonance of backing out grows massively. Persuaders use these small, public commitments to trap us into much larger compliance, simply because we want to avoid the sheer awkwardness of inconsistency.
Which brings us to our final section, Section 5, the persuasion radar.
Now, the good news is we aren't totally defenseless. We are not just passive sponges soaking up all this influence. When we suspect that a persuasion agent has, devious motives, or when a message contains obvious cues revealing that they are actively trying to persuade us, our internal persuasion radar goes off. Ding! We recognize we're being sold to, and we immediately deploy strategies to basically inoculate ourselves. Our goal? To maintain our current attitude and completely resist that attitudinal change.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how elegantly it maps out our exact defensive playbook. This framework organizes some pretty complex academic research into a highly readable guide on human pushback. Just look at the motives here. If we feel our freedom is being threatened, our go-to strategy is avoidance. We literally just selectively ignore the message. If we're reluctant to change, we use biased processing to give way less weight to new facts. Or we empower our existing beliefs by seeking social validation from our own little echo chambers. And if we have deception concerns, like if we think we're being flat out lied to, we actively contest the content, the source, and the tactics being used against us. Contesting the content is a deeply fascinating thought process. When incoming information clashes with our held beliefs, we detect that discrepancy and immediately start generating counterarguments. And this is exactly why forewarning is so absolutely crucial. If you warn an audience up front about a persuasive message, you give them a time delay. They use that buffer time to build up their mental counterarguments and mentally tear down the source, making them highly resistant by the time the actual message even arrives.
But interestingly enough, persuaders have actually found sneaky ways to bypass these defensive empowerment strategies, and they do this primarily through something called self-affirmation. See, by allowing an audience to focus on other, totally unrelated valued aspects of themselves, persuaders help the audience feel a strong sense of integrity. And when people feel secure in their own identity, the reluctance to change actually lowers, and they end up responding much more openly to counter-attitudinal messages.
Wow, okay, so we have unpacked the academic equations, the psychological levers, the deep tension of dissonance, and the radar of our own resistance. Persuasion isn't just theory, it is a constant, simultaneous dance happening all around us every single day. So as you go back out into the real world armed with this new map of human influence, I want to leave you with this one question. In your own life, in your very next interaction, are you the persuader or the persuaded? Keep learning, stay focused, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.